When was the last time a game genuinely surprised you? Not just impressed you with its graphics, massive open world, or expensive cinematics. I mean properly surprised you, where you loaded it up and expected something small, and several hours later you realized you were playing one of the best games of the year. For a lot of people, that game was probably an indie. Maybe it was Hades, Hollow Knight, Balatro, Stardew, Lethal Company, Vampire Survivors, Celeste, or even Undertale. That is the strange position gaming is in right now. Some of the most creative, addictive, and culturally important games are no longer coming exclusively from the biggest studios. They're coming from smaller teams with fewer resources, but often far clearer ideas. Years ago, indie games were treated like side projects. They were the little games you play between the major releases. The assumption was that the real event would always be the next enormous blockbuster, but that distinction is slowly disappearing. Indie games are not just competing with AAA releases anymore. In many cases, they set the standards that the rest of the industry ends up following, and the reason is not simply that they're cheaper or easier to access. It is because indie games are giving players something increasingly valuable, experiences that feel genuinely different. Now, AAA gaming is not dead. We still get brilliant blockbuster games, and there are experiences that only a massive studio can realistically create. Indie developers are not suddenly going to replace Rockstar, Nintendo, PlayStation, or every other major publisher, but a lot of modern AAA gaming has become extremely predictable. You know the structure before you even play it. There will probably be a massive map. That map will be covered in icons. There will be crafting materials, skill trees, gear scores, upgrade menus, and enough collectibles to keep you occupied until retirement. None of those things are automatically bad. The problem is that after seeing them in game after game, they stop feeling exciting. You begin to recognize the template underneath everything. The graphics improve, the world becomes larger, and the cutscenes become more expensive, but the actual experience can still feel strangely familiar. Then something like Balatro appears. It's a poker-inspired roguelike, built around creating absurd combinations of cards, multipliers, and special jokers. That description should not sound more exciting than a gigantic cinematic adventure, but once Balatro gets its claws into you, it becomes incredibly addictive. Every run creates a new problem, and every joker changes how you approach your deck. A normal poker hand can suddenly become part of a completely ridiculous scoring machine. Balatro does not need a huge world because its depth comes from the way its mechanics interact. It takes one focus idea and explores it properly. That is something indie games are incredibly good at. Hollow Knight is one of the best examples of how dramatically indie games have evolved. This doesn't feel like a lesser version of a bigger game. Hollow Nest is a huge interconnected world filled with hidden areas, strange characters, difficult bosses, and entire sections that some players may never discover. The atmosphere is deep, dark, and mysterious. There is this constant feeling of loneliness as you descend deeper underground, uncovering the remains of a civilization that has already collapsed. The game does not constantly explain itself. It lets the architecture, music, and environmental details tell the story. And because the world is not covered in objective markers, exploration feels meaningful. You are not traveling somewhere because the game has placed a glowing symbol on the map. You're traveling because you saw an unusual path and became curious. That distinction matters. Hollow Knight understands that discovery is far more satisfying when it feels like your discovery. It proves that the size of the development team has almost nothing to do with the size of the imagination behind the game. Then you have Hades, which takes one of the most frustrating parts of gaming, dying, and turns it into something you almost look forward to. Every failed escape attempt brings Zagreus back to the house of Hades, but instead of feeling like you have simply lost your progress, you return to new conversations, character development, upgrades, and story moments. The game understands that in a roguelike, the player is going to fail repeatedly, so rather than treating failure as wasted time, it builds the entire narrative around it. That is intelligent game design. The story and gameplay are not fighting each other, they support each other. You keep playing because the combat feels excellent, but you also keep playing because you want to speak to the characters again. You want to know what Hades is going to say after your latest embarrassing defeat. You want to develop your relationship with Nyx, Achilles, or Megara, and everyone else waiting back at the house. Hades could have simply been a brilliant action game. Instead, Supergiant created a structure where repetition becomes emotional progression. That is why it became more than just another roguelike. It became one of the most widely respected games of its generation. Hey, but what about Stardew Valley, the greatest farming / life sim ever, right? Stardew represents another side of the indie takeover. It's not intense, it's not trying to overwhelm you with spectacle. It's a game about moving to a quiet town, growing crops, meeting people, and gradually building a life. But that simplicity is deceptive. There is always something pulling you forward. You want to improve your farm, explore the mines, complete the community center, build friendships, or simply see what changes when the next season arrives. What makes Stardew Valley special is how personal everything feels. The game was not assembled by a giant committee trying to appeal to every possible type of player. It came from one developer, with a clear love for farming games and a strong idea of how to expand them. That consistency is visible everywhere. The music, characters, routines, progression, and small town atmosphere all feel like parts of the same vision. And that is one of the major advantages indie games often have. They know exactly what they are. Stardew Valley does not constantly interrupt your peaceful farming experience because somebody decided it needed a battle pass, a competitive mode, or a completely unrelated mechanic to increase engagement. It is confident enough to be itself. Another reason why indie games are dominating conversations is that they are willing to be weird. Look at something like Vampire Survivors, right? At first glance, it looks almost too simple. Your character attacks automatically, enemies flood the screen, you move around, collect upgrades, and attempt to survive increasingly ridiculous waves. But that simplicity is exactly why it works. The game removes almost everything standing between the player and the satisfaction of becoming more powerful. Within minutes, you go from desperately avoiding a few enemies to filling the entire screen with projectiles, explosions, and spinning weapons. It is pure escalation. The game understands the basic pleasure of watching a weak character become completely overpowered, and it builds everything around that feeling. A giant publisher might have looked at Vampire Survivors and decided it needed more complexity, a deeper story, expensive cutscenes, or some kind of a long-term online ecosystem, but adding more would probably have made it worse. The restraints is part of the design. Indie developers are often better at recognizing when a simple idea is already enough. Lethal Company is another game that demonstrates why visual spectacle is not the only way to create memorable moments. Most people don't remember Lethal Company because of its textures or animations. They remember the time their friend confidently entered a dark building, screamed over the radio, and was never seen again. They remember somebody dropping all of the valuable scraps while running from a monster, or carefully organising a mission only for the entire plan to collapse within 30 seconds. Lethal Company gives players a set of rules and then allows panic, friendship, and stupidity to create the entertainment. The best moments are not scripted, they happen naturally. That makes every group feel like it has its own stories. And those stories spread online. They become clips, memes, and conversations between friends. The game became popular because watching people play it made you immediately want to experience that chaos yourself. That is far more powerful than any carefully controlled marketing trailer. Indie games are also willing to tell stories in unusual ways. Undertale looks basic at first. Its visuals are simple, its combat is strained, and its humor can be completely ridiculous, but underneath that is a game that pays close attention to how the player behaves. It remembers your decision. It questions habits that most games encourage, particularly the assumption that every enemy exists purely to be defeated. The characters stay with people because the game makes the player feel responsible for what happens to them. Celeste does something similar with its mechanics. It is a brutally difficult platformer, but its challenge is directly connected to its story about anxiety, self-doubt, and perseverance. Climbing the mountain is not merely the objective, it becomes a physical representation of Madeline's internal struggles. Every failed jump can be frustrating, but the game encourages you to try without treating failure as shameful. That kind of cohesion is why relatively small games can leave such huge emotional impact. People sometimes talk about indie games as though their success comes from nostalgia or lower expectations. I think that completely misses the point. Hollow Knight wants to create discovery and atmosphere. Hades wants every failed run to matter. Balatro wants to turn simple cards into an endlessly addictive strategy game. Stardew Valley wants to make you feel attached to a farm and community. Lethal Company wants to create unpredictable stories between friends. These games are not trying to contain every popular mechanic in the industry. They begin with a strong central idea and build outward from it. That is why they often feel more memorable than games offering hundreds of hours of content. More content does not automatically mean more personality. A game can have a massive map and still leave almost nothing behind once you finish it. Meanwhile, an indie game lasting 10 hours can stay in your head for years to come. Indie games are not taking over because players have suddenly stopped enjoying big budget releases. They are taking over because the definition of an important game has changed. A game no longer needs the largest marketing campaign or the most advanced graphics to dominate the conversation. It needs a strong idea. It needs an identity, and most importantly, it needs to give players something they have not already experienced 20 times before. That is what the best indie games do. They remind us that gaming does not have to become bigger every year to become better. Sometimes all it takes is a strange poker game, a lonely kingdom beneath the ground, a farm in a quiet town, maybe a failed escape from the underworld, or 4 friends shouting at each other inside an abandoned facility. Indie games have gone from filling the gaps between major releases to becoming some of the major releases themselves. They are shaping genres, influencing larger studios, and producing many of the experiences that players are most passionate about. And the healthiest part of this entire shift is that nobody knows where the next massive game is going to come from. It could have come from a famous studio with thousands of employees, or it could come from one developer working on an idea that sounds completely ridiculous until the rest of us finally get to play it. That unpredictability is exactly what gaming needs, because the moment an industry becomes completely predictable is the moment it starts becoming boring. And right now, indie developers are making sure that gaming is anything but boring.